Hey, what's up, everybody? Garrett Grumley here with Duty to Train. This is going to be part one of a series of videos where I do a quick review of The Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, which is a podcast done by Jocko Willink's kind of co-host. He goes way in depth into the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, basically how it all started, why the Jews wanted to go back to Israel in the first place. It basically starts back in like roughly the 1850s, and then he just like brings you all the way through. I'm only like through it's a 6 episode series, and each one is between like 2.5 to 3.5 hours. So it's roughly 20-25 hours of content, and I'm just going to break down all of the most important details, and I'm going to make like every 30 to 45 minutes like a 10-minute snippet on this series. So I'm just going to jump right into it. The first thing he talks about is you have to understand like how violent it was for the Jews back in like the late 1800s. So back in 1860, 70, 80, the pogroms that were happening in Europe and especially in Russia were super, super violent. And quick little disclaimer, I'm about to explain some things that are really, really gory and disgusting, but there were so many pogroms. The first thing he does in the podcast series is talk about how, anti-Semites would come into Jewish towns and would literally rape the women, kill the husbands, and then rip the babies like apart, like limb by limb, like literally ripping babies apart. And like that's how evil and terrible this stuff was. And that is kind of the background of what the Jews were dealing with on like a constant and ongoing basis. So it would ramp up and then it would like die down, and then it would come back and it would ramp up and then it would die down. So Jews were blamed for things like the Black Plague in the 1400s, and they were used as scapegoats for other things for like centuries. For centuries this was happening. And so you have to understand that when Jews were like, hey, we need our own place, when they wanted to go back to Israel eventually, this is like the backdrop for that. It wasn't like, oh, we just want Israel back. If you were like literally systematically hunted for like centuries and you didn't feel safe anywhere, and I'll go into this, you'd be like, hey, we need some type of homeland. So that's kind of like the whole backdrop for this. So between 1881 and 1884, there were 200 plus pogroms in Russia alone. And what a pogrom is basically like a state-sanctioned like mini genocide, right? So like the cops don't do anything, the state doesn't do anything. The citizens, like the anti-Semite citizens, were basically allowed to just go into these towns and then just kill all the Jews. And there were no, legal repercussions for any of like the Russian citizens for doing this. And between 1881 and 1914, 2.5 million Jews fled the Russian Empire because they were sick of the pogrom genocide. They became involved in socialism and other forceful movements. So one of the things that is important to understand is that the Jews they're not like very mellow people in this time, right? They were a big part of the Russian communist takeover. They wanted to be a part of like these like empire altering movements. So they didn't just want to like peacefully settle at first. They wanted to like upend, countries just like lots of other people did. But they weren't like these quiet, mellow sort of people, and that's important to understand. They were involved in Bolshevism, which is just the communist takeover, Lenin and Stalin taking over Russia back in the early 1900s. And then Zionism, if you don't know what Zionism is, it's basically just like an intense form of Judaism. But a lot of people, and the guy says this in the podcast series, when you think of Zionism, a lot of people think of like an old Jewish man, dressed in like normal garb. And back in the day, that's not what Zionism was. Like Zionism was like a very intense thing. They were competing in order to get recruitment. When Zionism started, like all these like communists and socialism and fascism and, all these different things, were sprouting up. And so in order to recruit members, they had to be a very intense organization, because nobody wants to be like a member of like, oh, let's just be peaceful. Like not when life sucks. Like you have to compete for membership. And so Zionism, when it originally started, not that it was more intense than any other, but they really wanted to like change the status quo. It wasn't like, hey, just leave us alone, we're just peaceful. Like they were very, very intense group and movement, just like all the other movements of the day. Just know that back then Zionism was not kind of what we think of it as today. There was a group of Jews and they called themselves the Beloim, and they were a group of Jews. They wrote a note of recruitment to Jews in Europe, and I just wanted to play that for you here.
Quote, "This spark is again kindling and will shine for us, a true pillar of fire going before us on the road to Zion." Zion, by the way, is a hill in the city of Jerusalem. "While behind us is a pillar of cloud, the pillar of oppression threatening to destroy us. Sleepest thou, O our nation? What hast thou been doing until 1882? Sleeping and dreaming the false dream of assimilation. Now, thank God, thou art awakened from thy slothful slumber. The pogroms have awakened thee from thy charmed sleep. Thine eyes are open to recognize the cloudy, delusive hopes. Canst thou listen silently to the taunts and mockeries of thine enemies?"
This note is important because it's showing that the Jews were finally waking up to the reality that they weren't ever going to be safe everywhere. No matter what they tried, no matter how hard they wanted to assimilate, eventually the pogroms would come for them. Eventually, they wouldn't be safe anymore. And so they started to realize, okay, we need to start thinking about how we can get away from this reality. And an important note is that at this point in time, they didn't see Islam as like their key arch enemy, right? A lot of people who say, oh, this has gone back and happened in thousands and thousands of years, or, decades and decades. This did seem to have a starting point, and I'm not an expert on this, but this makes a whole lot of sense. Up until this point, Jews lived in Europe and Russia, and there weren't a whole lot of Muslims living in those areas at the time. And so when they came under like systemic oppression and genocide, basically, and all these pogroms, it wasn't at the hands of Islam and Muslims. It was at the hands of Europeans and Russians. And so in the late 1800s, they didn't see Islam as their arch enemy. They saw Christian whites in Europe and Russia as the people they had to escape from. And I want to play one more bit from you. It's a guy called Theodor Herzl, and he is considered the father of modern political Zionism. And he wrote a letter talking about how Jews have tried to get away from anti-Semitism, but they can't. And so I just want to play you that clip real quick.
Quote, "No one can deny the gravity of the situation of the Jews. Attacks in parliaments, in assemblies, in the press, in the pulpit, in the street, on journeys, for example, their exclusion from certain hotels, even in places of recreation, become daily more numerous. The forms of persecution varying according to the countries and social circles in which they occur. In Russia, imposts are levied on Jewish villages. In Romania, a few persons are put to death. In Germany, they get a good beating occasionally. In Austria, anti-Semites exercise terrorism over all public life. In Algeria, there are traveling agitators. In Paris, the Jews are shut out of the so-called best social circles and excluded from clubs. Shades of anti-Jewish feeling are innumerable, but this is not to be an attempt to make out a doleful category of Jewish hardships. The nation in whose midst the Jews live are all either covertly or openly anti-Semitic." End quote.
So his point in making this letter is that no matter where the Jews go, they're going to bring anti-Semitism. They try to get away, but they can't. And he called on all Jews to escape and build up the land of Palestine. He called on the rich Jews to support the mission, and then the poor people to immigrate and move to this new land. But he knew that the strongest impediment to this like mission of Zionism would actually be fellow Jews, because Jews in more comfortable areas and nations around the world, they just wanted to assimilate. They were like, people in France who weren't experiencing this, they were like, dude, I'm not going to move, to Palestine when, my family's safe. We're not experiencing anti-Semitism here. It seems to have died down. But Theodor Herzl's point is that no matter where you go, no matter how hard you try, eventually it pops up and then your family will no longer be safe. So that's what he's trying to get across here. The reason this kind of came around, this letter, was because in 1894, a maid in a German embassy in France discovered letters proving that a French traitor was passing secrets to the Germans. And so a French army captain called Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew, was court-martialed. He was blamed for this. He was court-martialed in like a really humiliating fashion. I guess they like broke his sword. They made a big deal of this. And it was soon discovered that Dreyfus was actually innocent, but the military manufactured evidence to cover up the mistake, and it started to keep coming out to light that, okay, this was not the guy. And there was even a lieutenant colonel who who presented irrefutable evidence of Dreyfus's innocence, and still the military wouldn't stop. And so this became kind of like a boiling point in the nation of France. And it was like the political hot topic of the day. Everybody had an opinion on it. And so it was like the people who were for Dreyfus against the people who weren't for Dreyfus, and this like increased the anti-Semitism of the time. And at this point, Theodore Herzl was a press correspondent in Paris, and he heard French citizens chanting death to the Jews. And to him, this proved that Jews would never be safe in Europe no matter where they went, because France was considered a safe spot up until this happened. And then all of a sudden it just boiled over, and he realized, okay, this came out of nowhere. And if we're not safe in France, we're never going to be safe anywhere. So this kind of leads us up to the point where the Jews are like, okay, what can we do? Where can we go that we will be safe? So we're not going to have to keep experiencing this type of adversity and genocide and killing and murdering and anti-Semitism. And so we're going to pick up next time with how they try to settle Palestine, their mission, how they start to go about doing that. And that's it for this episode. So I hope you've enjoyed this. It's a lot, but I've seen some other videos of people doing like quick overviews, but they don't really give any like hardcore points. It's just kind of like general synopses. So I wanted to give you like the facts in quick order so that you would have a better understanding, but you didn't have to listen to 25 hours. And frankly, I wanted to educate myself because this is like a very, very interesting topic. And frankly, it's just like really, really cool history. It's super sad, but I really like history, and so this is right up my alley. So I'm going to keep listening to this. I'll keep posting videos, and until next time, stay safe, live free, and we'll pick up with how the Jews started to settle Palestine next time. Take care.